So I made a video a couple of weeks ago talking about playing Commander using banned cards. I think we should take back our casual power. Play with cards that we can't play anywhere else. I think when you play casual Magic, you should play with banned cards. And I thought it would be fun to walk through one of my decks that uses banned cards. Now, something I advocate for in the video, and also just generally, is that when you're using banned cards in your deck, don't try to make your entire deck banned cards. This isn't about making a format that has completely wacky rules that plays completely differently from the regular game. I think it's about integrating cards that fit a specific theme, strategy, or general comedic effect that you can play in a regular Commander game. When you approach a table to play with a deck that has banned cards, make sure you're upfront about that. If they say that they'd rather not play with any banned cards, try to have alternatives in line. So if somebody doesn't want to play with a Rarity deck, Sten can stand in. It's an alternative card that reduces the cost of specific card types. So as needed, Sten can reduce artifacts, enchantments, or creatures, whatever we need to help us hit our combo pieces. Now the deck generally is very quick, and it's centered around a number of different combos. Our Commander, either of them, reduces the mana cost of all cards functionally in the deck that we care about by 1 generic mana. Rarity does this by reducing all rares and mythic cards. Sten does that by reducing specific card types. So as long as we're careful, they are functionally redundant with each other. I never run both. It's not really necessary, but it's good to have that alternative. So let's look at the deck a little bit, and we can walk through some of the cards that we chose. But first, I want to look at the cards that we didn't choose, because I think what is often more telling about a deck is which cards were cut. So starting with our artifacts, again, we have a number of different combos. You can see that we are not using Crystal Shard, Lightning Greaves, Ensnaring Bridge, Junk Diver, Retriever, Ornithopter. A bunch of artifacts that we can recur from the graveyard, play very cheaply, or use to generally slow down others and speed up ourselves. The reason we're not using a lot of these is because they're not rare. There's a couple in here that are. Junk Diver is a rare card, but the others are not, so we don't get the benefit of the mana cost reduction that Rarity provides, and on top of that, a lot of these cards don't work with the combos that we're using in this deck, so they've all been cut. In our blue cards, we have a Patron of the Moon, which acts as a fun combo piece with a couple of the Moonfolk, but we are not using that because on its own, it doesn't help us enough. Then we have a whole bunch of draw power. A Time Spiral, a Treasure Cruise, a Zombie, Magus of the Bazaar, and Magus of the Jar. All of these cards are very powerful. All of these cards are rare, with the exception of Treasure Cruise, and all of them allow us to draw a bunch of cards. Unfortunately, we don't really need that. The rest of the deck does a very good job at drawing a bunch of cards, and these are ultimately redundant. I could see an argument for Time Spiral being included, but at the high mana cost, most of the time if we are hitting that 6 mana in a reasonable time frame, we don't even have 6 lands to untap. We're not ramping in a conventional sense. We have a lot of artifact mana in this deck, and this just doesn't play well with that. So, these have also been cut. I have a couple cycle lands that were removed. They're not worth it with the comes into play tapped ability. They're just not fast enough. And in white, I have a Karmic Guide that was also removed. It creates some interesting loops, and I think there is an argument for including it in the deck, but with the way that it's built right now, it's just not as useful as it should be. So these are the cards that were removed from the deck. Now let's get into the cards that are included in the deck. So because of the way Rarity functions and our ultimate goals with the decks, I think it's important that we start by talking about cards that work together in specific ways and what our ultimate goal, our win condition, should be. So I'm going to start off with a few different packages that I have that interact very well together, and you can get a good feel for what we are trying to accomplish here. First, we have our Deadeye Navigator package. These are cards that work well with Deadeye Navigator, a card that allows you to flicker one of your other creatures in play. Things like Archaeomancer, Felidar Guardian, Blessed Sanctuary, Phantom Steed, all interact very positively with cards like Peregrine Drake, and Eldrazi Displacer to create infinite mana, infinite tokens, or just flicker our things for so much value our opponents simply can't compete. All of this obviously serves to either draw out our entire deck or just cast enough cards that we can keep the rest of the table under control. You'll notice that this isn't necessarily a hard lock or a hard win, it's just to generate immense amounts of value. There's other combos that end the game instantly, but this whole pile all interacts very well together to flicker things and generate lots of value. Another win condition that we have included in the deck is Approach of the Second Sun. Now this is a card that I'm not running as a combo piece. I don't have ways to create multiple copies of this or any of that kind of thing. This is just a card to be played straight up and use the value that we generate from other cards to eventually draw it again, recast it, and win the game. We have a couple other unique little loops that we can make with Words of Wind and Vidalcan Archmage. Archmage is whenever you play an artifact, draw a card, and Words of Wind allows you to skip a draw to force everybody to bounce a permanent. There's a lot of ways of making tons of mana, so this allows you to draw a ton of cards, or make everybody bounce every permanent that they have in play by looping the same artifact coming into play over and over. Now that can be anything, but usually Sensei's Divining Top is the artifact of choice. It's in here, but it's a little bit lower. Another fun interaction is King Brago Eternal and Strionic Resonator. These work well together to allow us to flicker any of our cards many times. Lotus Bloom and Tameshi Reality Sculptor allow us to repeatedly bring back the bloom, drawing a card the first time, but potentially creating infinite mana with a couple of other cards that we have in our deck. Finally, our most common win condition is some form of either Rarity or Helm of Awakening to reduce the cost of our spells, and then cards like Future Sight, Reality Chip, and Mystic Forge to allow us to cast cards off the top of our library, to repeatedly cast Sensei's Divining Top, drawing our entire deck, and closing off with a Jace Wielder of Mysteries to win the game. And if that fails, we have our enchantment plan, using cards like Enchanted Evening to turn all permanents into enchantments, making Ajani and Archon of Sun's Grace produce infinite creatures, and Aura Thief to steal all permanents in play. These cards all overlap in very interesting ways, allowing you to win the game almost on the spot, but more generally create so much overwhelming value that you can power out most of your deck before your opponent has a chance to respond. I really like the way these cards interact, and I think you can see the special frame treatments and art treatments of the cards allows the majority of these cards to be printed at rare, even if they never were in a main set. So now that we know our win conditions, I think the next logical thing we have to ask is, how do we get there? What steps do we take to get to those win conditions? And I think ultimately it comes down to two things, one being ramp and one being card advantage. So let's walk through each of these individual categories and look at the cards that we've included to power out those wins. Under ramp, at 1 mana we have Sol Ring and Wayfarer's Bauble. At 2 mana we are fairly overloaded with Arcane Signet, both diamonds, both signets and talisman, a Mind Stone, Chromatic Lantern, Thran Dynamo, and Gilded Lotus, and then we have a few card advantage cards that also produce mana or allow us to do other things in service of those win conditions. Ashnod's Altar breaks loops and allows us to sacrifice Aura Thief. Swiftfoot Boots gives us haste and an ability to protect our commander and some of our other more relevant creatures. And Skull Clamp, well, we're going to be making a bunch of tokens over the course of the game. This allows us to add a little bit more insurance to them and draw cards if we have any other way to sacrifice them. These cards together allow us to power out a lot of our more expensive cards and allows us to generally have some insurance plan against land destruction and board removal, so we can rebuild fairly quickly. The other half of this equation, in our card advantage, we have a few flavors here. The first is the ability to draw and filter. The second is our ability to search. So I have a Ponder and a Brainstorm on the draw, a Mystical Tutor and an Enlightened Tutor on the search. Every other card we have in here follows some form or combination of those abilities to draw or search. And this allows us to power out a lot of our combo pieces whether that's out of the graveyard, out of our hand, or just off the top of our deck. Muldrifter interacts positively with all of our flicker cards. Trade Routes gives us something to do if we have lands stuck in our hands. And with the amount of artifacts that we are using to tap for mana, typically we don't need all of the lands that we have in play. Trinket Mage is purely there to search for Sensei's Divining Top. That's the reality. Occasionally you'll find something else, but 99% of the time, that's what you're going for. Finally, we have Sharknado, the Council of Four, and Dragonlord Ojutai. These are high mana cost, late game card advantage engines that allow us to punish players for doing cool things. And that's all we really care about. We want to slow our opponents down where we can and build card advantage when we can't. This allows us to get ahead of our opponent and allows us to assemble one of our combos that we showed at the beginning of the video. Now that we know how we're generating mana and how we're generating card advantage, the last piece that's missing is the Azorius part of the deck. The part that everyone hates. Everyone knows it, and everyone hates it. And that is taxes. Every Azorius deck has to have some build that taxes our opponent and forces them to make hard choices over the course of a game. Periphery Nodes and Overburden punish creature-heavy strategies. Mystic Remora and Rhystic Study punish more spell-slinging strategies. Smothering Tithe punishes everybody. These cards aren't super fun to have in play, but I think they're necessary if you're playing a deck that plans on winning in the later turns of the game. We're not trying to instantly win the game. We want to hold off until we can assemble some Rube Goldberg machine that allows us to draw a ton of cards, play a bunch of cards, and win the game that way. In order to protect our combo, we have a few other pieces with Silence, Cyclonic Rift, Mystic Confluence. We have a couple alternative locks using Stasis and Loxodon Gatekeeper. I played back in the day when this was a fairly common strategy using Kismet, and it's still pretty fun to do in Commander. Finally, we have Grand Arbiter Augustin, the face of Azorius control. We have a Spellbinder and a Thalia Heretic Cathar. All of these cards slow our opponents down to allow us to speed up, get to a combo piece, and win the game. With all of these pieces combined, we have a solid 8 or 9 out of 10 Commander deck. It's fairly powerful. It uses exactly one banned card, but I don't think it does anything that really goes against the spirit of the game. I'd walk through the lands, but it's not particularly interesting. There's only a few notable cards. Most cards that we care about are going to be our colorless lands that allow us to interact with the things that we have in play. Academy Ruins brings artifacts back to our hand. High Market allows us to get creatures off the table. This can break any enchantment creature loops and can also protect cards from exile. Then we have a few mana fixing cards, a few draw cards, and we are running the complement of artifact lands that allows us to loop our Moonfolk. And that is the entire deck. You'll find the list down in the description of the video. I think it's a really fun deck to play. I think it has a good mix of fast combo with some of those control strategies. And as much as people complain about Stax pieces, I think they're important at keeping the game relatively balanced when you have higher powered decks playing with lower powered decks. This deck can do a very good job of policing the entire table in a way that allows it to still be fun for some of the lower powered decks that are interacting at a more one-to-one scale. Anyways, that's my Rarity deck. I think it's pretty cool. It's got some cool interactions, it's got some beautiful art in it, and it's something that I really like to play. Thanks for watching.